With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. As always, I'm your host, Caleb Colquitt for News Radio 1440, and we do appreciate you making us a part of your day every single day. As we've been doing for the past several weeks now, we start out with our coronavirus update. So we'll go ahead and jump into that right now. This is the latest from the Alabama Department of Public Health. We'll go ahead and pull up that graphic real quickly. So you will see there that the total cases has risen a bit, 3,876. Our total tested has increased about a moderate amount. It's about on par with what would be expected. The total deaths from the illness has risen substantially, and we'll talk about that in a second. That is 73, and our hospitalization has gone up a touch. It's 493. So the big outlier, the thing that has gone up by a substantial amount today, is the death toll, which has gone up by 11. So this is something that is really interesting that I wanted to address. Out of all of the statistics, that's the only one that seems like it's out of place today. And it's really interesting because this is such a sporadic statistic, because it trails behind the others by a good bit, and also trails behind and doesn't necessarily follow that pattern, because one patient that comes in, he might be having some real complications with this virus and dies that afternoon. Another patient may come in and he may last for a week and then hit complications and pass away. That's unlikely, but it's possible. And so it's not only a lagging statistic, it's also a statistic that is inconsistent, that you don't, if you're in the hospital, you don't stay in there for a set amount of time. So that's the reason that it is so incredibly difficult to track. Just to give you an understanding about this, the death total and the death rate had pretty much flatlined to a great degree. And we went from having 10 last week to going back down to 0 in one day. Then we went back to having only one death in one day. And then yesterday was the highest it's ever been at 11. So it's just, this statistic is all over the place. It doesn't fit in any kind of foreseeable pattern with the other statistics. It's very difficult to predict. And so really what it comes down to is we just do not have a way to track this thing or predict where it's going to go. And I know that that's frustrating. It bothers me, of course, as well. And another thing that is problematic about the death toll is that it is still higher than expected, because we went to, we're looking at this compared to the confirmed cases, then it's still under 2%, but that's higher than normal. We're currently at 1.88% as far as confirmed cases. Of those confirmed cases, how many people die? Right now, we're at 1.88, which is still high. Granted, it's a tiny, tiny percentage when you're looking at 73 deaths over the course of a state that has 4.888 million people. So I understand it's still a tiny portion of our overall population, but at the same time, what is going on here is it's still higher than it really should be. We're supposed to be experiencing a death rate at roughly 1%, floating around there somewhere, and we're up at 1.88. That seems odd, especially when you're considering that you may have seen, theoretically, an accelerated or inflated death rate if we were talking about some kind of hospital shortage. But as of yet, that has not happened. There's not been a single person in Alabama or in the United States, which is just a fascinating statistic, that even at this point, there has not been a person with coronavirus that needed a hospital bed that was denied a hospital bed, or they couldn't find one for him somewhere, whether it was an ICU, whether it was a ventilator. Considering what other countries are going through, that's absolutely phenomenal. And people, both in the individual states and at the federal level, ought to be commended for doing their part on that. That is an amazing statistic, and it's no wonder that the White House is trotting that out as a gauge to help people understand how positive the response has been so far. And that's also true in the state of Alabama, which makes it so odd that the death rate is higher than it really should be. I don't know if that's because there's just an awful lot of Alabamians out there that haven't gotten the diagnosis and they've just been asymptomatic, or they have been symptomatic but not bad enough to justify getting the test, and so we got a whole bunch of people out there that just aren't being tested for it, and that's what's really going on. I don't know, but it does seem odd that that stat is as high as it is. By the way, just so you know, our current rate of hospitalization is still roughly 12%, but it is increasing. If you were to round to the nearest number, it would actually be at 13. I believe it was at 12.78, if I'm remembering my math correctly. I didn't write that one down. I just happen to remember it from doing my calculations. But so it hasn't really moved, and we'll give you any news if that one actually does move. But suffice it to say right now, it is trending upward, but at a very, very tiny rate. So we will update you on that if there is anything to update you on that. Let's go ahead and look at this next graph, which looks at the confirmed cases in the state of Alabama. And there's something really interesting going on here that I want you to notice. And it is slight. But do you notice that when you're looking at the total confirmed cases, you're seeing, granted, not much of an incline, or at least not a very steep incline, I should say. It's at roughly a 45-degree angle. There's a bit of a dip there in the middle. But if you're looking at the overall trajectory of our current cases, it's amazing to me that what you're seeing, at least right now, is a little bit of a leveling off, because they increase by a pretty similar margin. In other words, it really is almost a 45-degree angle, and it's really kind of odd that we've gotten that close to it. It's not a very steep incline at all. And then you'll notice over the past really about 4-ish days, those increases have gotten less obvious. And so it looks as though, granted, this is a cursory reading, so I don't want y'all going out saying Caleb Colquitt said for sure what we have done is we have peaked. But it does look as though we're in the starting phases of a peak, and if we are doing so earlier, which means our response was better than our neighbors across the ocean in Italy and Spain and so forth. It is very possible that what we're seeing is that spike not only isn't going to happen, that exponential spike where we're seeing a doubling or tripling of our cases, but it looks as though we may even actually have leveled off. Now, that is a bold claim. It's a very bold claim. I understand that. And it is possible, of course, that this is just a fluke and we're going to see increases in greater numbers tomorrow or the next day. I mean, that claim could be basically ruined by literally just 24 or 48 hours. And I get that. But I'm saying if you're looking at that curve and you're looking at how it has somewhat of an incline and that incline just kind of starts to level, I think we may actually be peaking right now. And if so, that is really astounding. So, looking at that and understanding it, it does seem like it's leveling. Let's go ahead and look at a third graph, and this is not total confirmed cases. These are just the new cases. Now, this one's really interesting, too, because it's just new cases for that one particular day. Now, you will notice that we started on a fairly substantial increase in new cases starting all the way back on April the 6th. And then we hit a big dip on April the 10th, and then spiked back up about to the level that we were on the 11th. But ever since the 11th, we've been trending downward in almost a mirror image of the previous 4 days right before that big spike on the 9th. So this is really interesting because all of this is consistent with what would be happening, theoretically. This is all consistent with what would be happening if you were seeing a location that were peaking for the coronavirus. Now, I'm not saying for certain that we have peaked. We may not have. And like I said, this whole thing, all the graphs that I've shown you could tell a completely different story tomorrow or the day after. That is a possibility, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat that. But it does look like we're peaking. And that is what the data that we have in front of us would suggest. So it's at least a possibility, because it seems as though when it comes to new cases, we're on a steady decline while our tests are simultaneously keeping pretty much on pace. Now, there has been a slight decrease in average testing overall over the past few days, but not one that would explain such a drastic decrease in new cases. So, it seems, based on the data we have right now, that Alabama has reached its peak. Has it? I'm not sure, but that's what it seems to be right now. Experts are saying no. Experts are saying that it's supposed to peak either late this week or maybe early next week. So there is some fighting amongst the experts, but here's the thing. I don't, especially when it comes to something like this, I do not like to attribute ill motives to people, especially when we're dealing with a situation where the data is so incredibly important. And because that data is important, I don't want to impugn the honor or assign some kind of evil motivation to people that are providing us with that data. Generally speaking, I like to assume, especially in a crisis situation like this, that everybody that is handling the numbers is trying to do so being an honest broker of the information. Unless I have another reason, a good reason, to believe otherwise. So I want you to understand, I'm just floating this theory out there. Is it possible that some of the people who are putting the data out there and distributing this information are lying to us? Now, again, I don't like to attribute some kind of ill motive like that. But remember that a lot of these same experts are the ones that were telling us that we were going to have a crazy amount of deaths, and that just literally within the month of April, right around the beginning of the month, we're predicting that Alabama by itself would have several thousand deaths. Some were estimating as high as 25 or 50,000. And now they're telling us it's more realistic to expect a few hundred. Which, I mean, is good. I'm glad that those projections have dropped significantly. But do you think it could be that these people are not going to tell us that we've peaked yet, because what they're afraid of is that the average person, once they hear that, is going to hear in their mind, oh, we've peaked, that means this is all over and I can go back to life as normal. And if you think, well, Caleb, that's impossible, they wouldn't treat us like that. Remember that these are the same experts that when their verdict came down from on high, they said, no, the N95 mask, that's not effective, you don't need those, that's ridiculous, and by the way, you shouldn't buy them because we need them for our hospital staff. Which was ridiculous, because then you were like, well, now hold on a second, why would the hospital staff need them and we wouldn't? Like, if it doesn't do any good, why are you stockpiling them for the hospital staff? Why are you stockpiling them for doctors and nurses? And believe me, I am sympathetic to the cause of doctors and nurses, and I think that if anybody needs them, it would be them. But what I am saying and trying to explain to you is that it would not be outside the realm of possibility for these people to use the same logic a second time. These same experts that are making these projections to think, well, the people, they're just too dumb to listen to us and not stockpile N95 mask. And then that's not a long trip to, well, these people, they're too dumb for us to be honest with them with what the data is showing, and showing that if you're looking at the data comprehensively, that the state of Alabama is starting to plateau and flatline. Again, maybe that's not the case. Maybe they're right and a spike is coming. But everything that we've seen from models in other places so far would suggest that the way a spike is going to look before it hits is that incline continues to get steadily higher and higher and higher, and we're seeing the exact opposite. It stays up for a little bit and then peaks. That's what we're seeing from the data that we have now. And so maybe these people really are just doing the best that they can to put out the project. And this is the thing that I want to believe, that they're really just doing the best that they can, and just like a weatherman or just like anybody else who is a professional, who is educated, that has information, sometimes they get things wrong because this is something that's really, really hard to predict. I've made several mistaken predictions in this thing, and believe me, it was not because I was trying to withhold information from anyone. What motive would I possibly have for doing so? But these people, not because of some kind of political goal in mind, in their mind, they're protecting the public from itself by lying to them and saying, no, this thing hasn't peaked yet, you've got to hang on. In the back of their mind thinking, well, it actually has peaked, but we're going to tell this to them and lie to them so that they won't mistakenly hear, well, we're just going to go out and do what we want to now. Look, I have more faith in the people of America and the state of Alabama than to lie to them. I give you the information, and then you do with that information what you will. Now, some people are going to use it incorrectly, some people are going to use it correctly, but ultimately, I do have a trust for the people. Seemingly, a lot of these experts don't. And this is one of the main reasons that, especially in a time of crisis like this, you do not lie to people like they did about the N95 mask, because now it's harder for me to accept that all these people are making these predictions and models in good faith. It's a lot harder for me to accept that their advice is sound and they're not trying to do some kind of weird social engineering thing with us on this. And I hate that, because I want to be able to trust the experts, and I want to believe that, especially at this time where the truth is incredibly important, that they would be honest with us. But I can't really rely on that now because they've already broken my trust once, and did so intentionally, knowing that what they were saying was BS. But thinking that I was too dumb to handle the information, and thinking that you were too dumb to handle that information and use it responsibly. Speaking of that, let's go ahead and go to Governor Will Ainsworth, because he had, did I say governor? Lieutenant Governor Will Ainsworth, not governor. Kay Ivey is still alive. Nobody panic. Meemaw is okay. But Lieutenant Governor Ainsworth was on a radio interview earlier today on WVNN, which is actually one of our sister stations up in Huntsville. And according to him, they are presenting a plan on reopening the state of Alabama and hoping that that is going to be done. Their target for right now is May 1st. And there's a couple reasons why I think that this is a really good idea. First of all, remember, this would not force businesses to be open, nor would it be forcing people to gather in giant groups. It would merely allow them to. Which means, and again, this goes back to trusting the people that we were just talking about, that they're kind of putting your fate in your own hands and saying, look, if you're still at high risk, if you're a vulnerable person, probably avoid doing much and maybe stay in self-quarantine. But if you're a business and you need to get back out there and start making money again, you can do that. And we would like to think that people would have the good sense, and, I'm sure that they're going to recommend this when it eventually does reopen, whenever it is, that for a while, you still keep 6 feet apart from one another, and you still wash your hands, and you still avoid hand-to-hand contact, that kind of thing. Just the common sense things to try to avoid spreading this disease, and that makes sense. Personally, another thing, too, this is one thing that I really hope we just stay in the habit of washing our hands. I would really appreciate that if that's just something we continue from here on out, because I'm a man, and when I go to the restroom in public, I go to a men's room, and you would be surprised at the number of men that just shake and leave. I mean, that's just the MO of some of these guys. Some people that, and it's not necessarily a class thing either. I've seen super rich guys do it. I've seen poor people do it. Regardless of what walk of life, I'm sure that there are some girls, even though I'm guessing it's a much smaller percentage of the population, that do this as well. But can we all just universally agree as a species that washing our hands on a very regular basis, especially after you use the bathroom, is a good idea? Can we keep that once all this is over? I hope so. I really do. But nonetheless, getting back off this tangent and onto what we're actually supposed to be talking about here, I do think because this is going to allow people to open up but not force them to open up, there are going to be some people that are financially well off that choose to just kind of stay the course and maybe stay closed for an extra week or something like that, especially if maybe you're a business that isn't necessarily one supplying things that are deemed more essential or whatever. And there's probably going to be some people that do open up, but maybe keep less staff on hand and don't do quite as much business or that kind of thing. So to try to avoid gathering a bunch of people in one place, there's a number of ways that you can do sort of a slow rollout. And I think that that would actually be really beneficial. And I appreciate that Lieutenant Governor Ainsworth is doing this and saying that, yeah, we're making plans to come out on May 1st. I know that there are some people that have been critical of this. There have been people that are critical of the president for trying to put a specific date on it. I think that's actually a really smart move. And the reason that I say that that is a smart move is because giving some kind of definitive date, putting some kind of closure on that is wise, because it lets people, it gives them a little hope that, hey, this isn't going to last forever. I think that it's really beneficial that somebody that is as economically minded as President Trump is in office, for example, and I'm actually really glad that he suggested we could be open as early as Easter, and of course that didn't happen, but the fact that he put that out there, that gives people a sense, look, this guy doesn't want me to stay at home indefinitely. This is not a guy that's going to say, hey, stay inside for 18 months, which is what I actually read an article yesterday that was suggesting this. When the average person hears that the people that are making these decisions are saying, look, we're going to get you back to work as soon as humanly possible. Believe me, we want the economy running. Because if nothing else, it benefits us. We want the economy running. We want it to be opened wide open again, just like it was beforehand. And because of that, the second that we believe that everybody is safe and that we can, we're going to take off all these stay-at-home orders. That's a good sentiment, because the people that are sitting at home that are going stir-crazy, myself included, are watching this and going, okay, I can hold out for another week or two. Okay, well, I can hang on to this just until we know for sure that this thing is actually blown over and it's safe to go outside and resume normal life again. And even when that happens, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious than I normally would be. That's a good thing, because it gives people hope, and because it also gives people a realistic timeline to where they're not just looking at a giant question mark for when they'll be able to go back to a baseball game or something. Gosh, I miss baseball. Anyway, that aside, I've been playing MLB The Show 18 just to keep myself occupied in my lack of baseball, my inability to go to a baseball game. But anyway, that's really neither here nor there. AL.com, and this is the last little piece of local information we'll give you. AL.com has moved to a subscription-based system, which is really interesting. Now, based on the tweet that I saw earlier today and based on the thing that I read about it, it seems as though what AL.com is doing is, instead of having content behind the paywall, which I'm assuming, since they're doing subscriptions now, they will have eventually, but because they are not moving things behind a paywall yet, it seems as though this is more like asking for donations like Wikipedia than actually having subscriptions where people have to pay to use the product. Now, personally, I think that this is, kind of pointless, because, let's be honest, if you can use something for free, or you can pay a subscription to use something, which one are you going to do? You're going to get it for free. Like, I don't care how much you like the product. As a general rule, unless you're somebody that just has a ton of money to spend around, you are not going to spend $120 a year to read AL.com. You're just not going to do it. There may be some people that just really love AL.com that are going to do that, but your average citizen of Alabama is simply not going to do it. And this is especially true of people that are around my age. Pretty much the millennials and the Gen Zers, all of them, they're just not going to pay to read news. I have lots of friends that are super involved in the news. I have a lot of friends that run in political circles, that they are incredibly well informed. They keep up with politics, local politics, federal politics. I mean, they're people kind of like me that they're just in that world, and because of that, they read a lot of news on a constant basis. Don't know a single one that has a subscription. Not one. Unless they work for a news company that is paying their subscription for them and they're not actually spending anything out of their own pockets, because I do have a few that are like that, they don't have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Now, there are some people that are my age, myself included, that will pay for video content. For example, the vast majority of Steven Crowder's audience tend to be younger men. You see a pretty good chunk, I wouldn't say a majority, but there's a plurality of people around my age in their 20s, 30s, 40s that are paying for a subscription to The Blaze or The Daily Wire. But if you're talking about paying to read a newspaper, which AL.com is, I know that they have video content too. I understand that they have like the War on Dumb and Reconomics and some of the other short videos they do. And they actually are pretty good. I'm not knocking them. But some of them are better than others. But anyway, the reason that I bring that up is AL.com is not going to be able to sustain itself through subscription-based service. It's just not going to happen. People are not going to pay to read the news. They just don't do that anymore. That's something our grandparents did, but not something that we do today. And maybe they'll sell enough subscriptions, I don't know, to older people if they go behind a paywall to do okay for a while, but that's going to destroy their web traffic numbers to a degree that they're just not going to be able to keep advertisers on board if this happens. And so I think it's a really dumb move by AL.com. I think especially being a local publication, they're just not going to have the base to be able to make something out of this subscription-based service. I just don't see them being able to do it. Maybe I'm wrong, but especially when you consider that there are newspapers much larger than them that cover national, international news, that kind of thing, that are literally asking you to pay $1 or $5 a month. Substantially less than AL.com is asking for. And they don't have that many subscribers either. Then I'm going to go ahead and take a wild guess and say AL.com subscription-based service at $10 a month is just not going to happen. So I think they're shooting themselves in the foot on this. But really what all this comes down to, we're looking at what happened with the state today, and it looks like there's at least a possibility that we're starting to peak. The message that I want all of you to take from this is, guys, hang in there. Because what we're doing is working. What we're doing seems to be having the effect that we desired for it to have. And that means that we need to hang on for just a little bit longer. You know, if you realize that you're doing really well in a race, I'm going to use a NASCAR race as my example. If you realize that you're doing a lot better than you thought you were, and you're, I don't know, say a couple car lengths ahead of the number 2 person, that's not when you back off. You back off, then you're liable to lose your lead. I mean, it's great that we're doing what we set out to do. It's great that we're accomplishing those goals. It's great that we're doing this and stopping this virus basically dead in its tracks, and that it's been far less obtrusive to our individual lives than it has been in a lot of other locations. But when it comes down to it, now's the time to make sure that we're battening down the hatches, because we're in the home stretch and we could win this thing if we just keep doing what we're doing. It's not the time to take unnecessary risk. It's not the time to rest on our laurels and say, yeah, we've got this thing whipped, we can go back. No. Hang on for another week or two, and then maybe we can open up and we'll all be okay. That's realistic. I think that's what we're doing, and that's what these numbers are saying to me. I hope that that's the way that you take it as well. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and jump to a break. We have a really fantastic interview on some religious liberty issues with an attorney, John Eidsmoe. He is a attorney for the Foundation for Moral Law, and we are going to talk with him. He's going to be joining us on phone in just a second when we come back from this break.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today here on Tactics. And next up, we have a special guest that will be joining us, Colonel John Eidsmoe, I believe is the way to say his name. I'll have to ask him about that. For the Foundation for Moral Law, he is an attorney that is here with us. And for those of you who don't know, Foundation for Moral Law has been handling quite a bit of cases here lately. We all know about what's been going on with different churches being told that they can't assemble, preachers being arrested, churchgoers being fined. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to talk about, and so we thought it only made sense to bring in somebody that is a constitutional law expert that can share with us some of his expertise. So welcome to the program, John Eidsmoe. Thank you for being with us.
Caleb, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
And I am saying your name right, correct?
It's Eidsmoe, but I don't care how you say it.
Eidsmoe, okay. Yeah, I have a weird last name too. I get Colquitt all the time, so I understand. I'm right there with you. So I actually have heard that you just recently, just a few minutes ago before coming on to this program, we're listening in on some sort of hearing. Could you kind of detail what's going on and give us a little backstory and what happened in the hearing?
This was a fascinating hearing in federal court. Normally, a oral argument in a federal court will take an hour at the very most. This was 2 hours and 10 minutes, and it was pretty remarkable. This involved a church called On Fire Christian Center in Louisville, Kentucky. And the mayor of Louisville had issued some pretty strong orders telling people that drive-in services would be illegal and that there their license plates would be taken down if they came, that they'd be turned over to the Department of Health. They could be subject to quarantine, things like this. And anyway, so Saturday, the federal district court for that district, Judge Justin Watkins or Walker, issued an order. And I think the wording of this order is absolutely amazing. I'm just going to read you just a little portion of it.
All right.
But here's what he says. He says, on Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. That sentence is one that this court never expected to see outside the pages of a dystopian novel, or perhaps the pages of The Onion. But 2 days ago, citing the need for social distancing during the current pandemic, Louisville's Mayor Greg Fisher ordered Christians not to attend Sunday services, even if they remain in their cars to worship, and even though it's Easter. The mayor's decision is stunning, and it is beyond all reason unconstitutional. And so he proceeded to enter an order enjoining Louisville from enforcing, attempting to enforce, threatening to enforce, or otherwise requiring compliance with any prohibition on drive-in church services at On Fire, the church in question. Well, anyway, that was issued without there being a hearing. That's rare, but in this case, when the mayor's order had come just on Thursday before Sunday, and when further threats of enforcement came on Friday, there was no time for a hearing, and so this temporary restraining order was issued on Saturday without a hearing. This afternoon, that is Tuesday afternoon, the hearing took place, and it was 2 hours and 10 minutes, and it was pretty remarkable. I'll be glad to talk about it more if you'd like me to.
Sure.
Well, I have to say in this case that the organization that was defending the church here, First Liberty, had their act together. They knew what they were doing. They knew the case law. They knew the record, and they handled it smoothly, and they handled it well, but with a very even-handed manner. And I have to say that Judge Walker was very even-handed. I think he showed a great deal of patience throughout the hearing. The attorneys for the city, and I'll grant you a couple of things. First of all, they probably were not experienced in constitutional law. That isn't their normal field, probably, but that's not really an excuse. Sure. And secondly, this hearing came on rather short notice, but they seemed ill-prepared. They did not understand the case law. They did not really know the record very well. They equivocated a great deal on what the mayor had said and kept trying to say the things that the mayor had said in a Facebook broadcast, which he said that these services are illegal, that doesn't constitute city policy, things like this. But anyway, I had a couple of interns here with me, and I was just saying, when you listen to them, you want to know how not to argue a case. That's the way not to argue it. But right. Anyway, I'm sure they tried their best. But yeah. I thought that the plaintiff, the church, had a very good day. The judge in this case then ordered that briefs be submitted next Tuesday, the 21st, and reply briefs, I believe, on the 29th of April, if I recall, and 28th, I guess that'd be, and no, on Thursday, the 23rd, and that as a result of all this, he is extending the temporary restraining order for a couple weeks. It'll be in effect until then, but anyway, I think that this is going to result in an order that clearly protects drive-in church services of this nature, and it certainly should. As one of the points that was made very effectively here in this case is that down at the local Walmart, you've got cars all over the place down there, people going in and out constantly, and yet they aren't concerned about that. They're not concerned about how many cars are in the parking lot at the liquor store, things like that, but they are concerned about the church. And anyway, if you even just subject the church to the same standard that you subject to all of the other business establishments, it seems like the church is entitled to be treated more fairly here. But the other thing is that they aren't subject to the same standard, because the Constitution in the First Amendment doesn't guarantee the freedom to buy liquor, the freedom to go to Walmart. It guarantees free exercise of religion. Right. In other words, religion is in a preferred place by the First Amendment, and that needs to be recognized here.
Well, and that's one thing that I was going to ask you about because I've been reading a lot of lawyers' opinions and a lot of people that are experts in constitutional law like yourself on this, and it seems to be that even the ones that believe that there is some precedent and some ability of the states or the local municipalities to be able to close a church, they seem to center it around this idea that the church cannot be specifically targeted or excluded. So in other words, you are able to shut down a church service if that is equally applied to other things that are not church services. So if you just sort of have a blanket law that says you're not allowed to congregate this many people in this space and it's enforced evenly, and that would include businesses and everything else, then that's constitutionally permissible, at least by some of the case law. But that's not what is happening here in this one particular case. So I was wondering if you could speak to that opinion. Is that an opinion that is held by the majority of constitutional lawyers? What's your take on that stance?
Okay, it's a good question, and let me try to sort this out.
Okay.
First of all, I would say that there's a general rule based on what we call the reserved state police power to protect the health and safety and welfare of the public, and nobody, I think, is questioning that the state has that power. Mm-hmm. And based on the case 1985 concerning vaccinations, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. But when we're talking about something that involves free exercise of religion or even freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, other rights like this, then the state has to have a much higher standard before it can enforce its provisions in a way that infringe upon those rights. Before you can infringe upon free speech or free exercise of religion, you have to have what we call a compelling state interest. In other words, a very high state interest, and it has to be a compelling interest that cannot be achieved by less restrictive means. In other words, even if we were to say that the state may have a compelling interest in preventing people from going into church services in the building.
Right.
And some would disagree on that. Some would say that the First Amendment on this is absolute. But even if we were to say that the state has that right, couldn't they achieve their interest by the less restrictive means of allowing them to have drive-in services? And I have to say that in no way, in the arguments that I just heard, in no way did the attorneys for the city present any convincing reason at all why they needed to prohibit people from going into drive-in services, except for the fact that they might not follow the social distancing that they should follow. But assuming that we do make sure they do that, they showed no reason whatsoever there. And so, again, even if the state has a compelling interest, they still have to achieve it by the less restrictive means.
Right. So they're kind of, even if they can defeat the argument that the right to assemble and to be able to worship is absolute, even if they could somehow get past that because of the state having that kind of, I forget the term that you used, but
police power is the term we usually use.
Right. So even if they determined that that is fair, they would still have to make the case that there was no other way to do it other than the way that they enforced this particular order.
Very well said. And not only that, but it isn't the responsibility of the church to prove that there is
right, the burden of proof
means that it works. The burden is on the state to prove that the less restrictive means would not work.
Right. So, and that, especially in, when you're talking about the law, that's a big deal when you don't have the burden of proof on you, because then it is incumbent upon your opponent to have to basically convince the judge that that is the way that it is. It's not upon you to prove them wrong, which I think puts them in a much more favorable position in this particular case.
It definitely does.
So, speaking of Kentucky, and I know that this is a different case, but I wanted to get your take on this one. Now, this was not a church in Kentucky that was trying to do a drive-in service. They actually did go inside. This is the Maryville, Kentucky, and what they had happened to them was they went into church services. There were no details in any of the stories that I could find or any of the research that I did on how many people were in there, how many cars there were, and what the state of Kentucky did in that situation is they basically put notices on their cars out in the parking lot and informed them that the health department was going to come by and speak to them, and it could result in fines and quarantines, that they would be legally required to stay in their home for 14 days, that kind of thing. What's your take on that one, and is this a similar religious liberty violation or at least potential violation?
Well, the state's interest in regulating where we've got people actually in a building together probably is stronger than it is when people are outside in cars.
Yeah, I would say
But,
that stands to reason, sure.
right. However, I would say this, that even still, I think they have to use the least restrictive means. And another term we use when we say least restrictive means is the means has to be narrowly tailored to the situation. Now, let me explain why that's important. Here in Alabama, the Alabama governor has issued an order now that churches may meet provided there are fewer than 10 people in attendance. I kind of interpret that to mean 9.9, but anyway.
Maybe bring in a real short person. That'll.
Well, there's some question there, but anyway, or so long as they are in their cars in the parking lot with the further provision that the cars have to be 6 feet apart.
Sure.
And now I see the reason for the rule, but here's just one thing as far as whether that rule is narrowly tailored. As far as how many people could be in an inside service, does that have to be the same in a very small building where maybe you couldn't have more than 10 people and keep them 6 feet apart? Do you need to enforce the same limit on a church that's maybe 50 times that size, where you could have maybe 100 people that are all social distancing properly? It seems to me that least restrictive means and narrowly tailored regulations means you need to consider the size of the building in determining how many people can be there. We do that for other occupancy purposes. Why can't we do it for churches in regard to this epidemic?
I mean, that's a good point. And one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I know that this may technically be more criminal law than constitutional law, but one thing that just struck me as very odd about that is it would be one thing if the police, and I realize it would definitely be more disruptive to the worship service, that it would be one thing if the police officers that were facilitating this actually went into the building and find the individuals that were congregating. But they didn't do that. They just took down the license plate numbers. And that to me seems like you could get into some really shaky legal ground as well, because you can't fine a vehicle for breaking the law, especially when there's not a law against parking in the church parking lot. There's a law against congregating. And for all they know, one of those cars might have been just in the parking lot because the parking lot in the gas station next door was full and they had to run in there. It could be that somebody just parked their car and left it there overnight for somebody to pick up. Like, you can't just assume that the owner of the car is breaking the law because the car happens to be in the parking lot. And so I kind of wanted to get your take on that as well.
Well, I agree with that too. And again, it could also be that maybe this car is registered to a husband and it was the wife that drove it to church that morning.
Right. That could also be
home,
yeah.
Possibly. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that could be dangerous too. And then if they're saying, but we're not going to file charges, all we're going to do is subject you to health screening and quarantining and so on. Well, for me to choose between, say, a $500 fine or being quarantined for 2 weeks, I'm not sure which I'd choose. But in other words, the
agreed, but I mean,
be quite severe, even if they're not criminal charges.
Right, but still, you're considering the implications of that, and I'm sure that you have. That would basically be the state putting you under 2-week house arrest without trial, without the ability to make your case to them. Like that. That's getting dangerously close to dystopian. I mean, some of the similar measures that China and North Korea have done. Or sorry, South Korea, not North Korea.
You're right. Supposedly these are for your good and for the public good, but imposed good can be as bad as imposed evil. So yes, I think that could be a very dangerous thing. Now, you might know about the case also that took place in Mississippi. This is over in Greenville, and last Wednesday night, a church in Greenville, let's see, what is the name? The King James Bible Baptist Church was having their Wednesday evening services.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, and they were outside services, proper social distancing and everything. But the police came by and issued a $500 ticket to every vehicle that came in for that service.
By the way, on that one, did you happen to see the video of the sheriff of that town that went viral?
I saw the video of the pastor when he was talking about it.
Oh no, there was a video that was circulating around, and I actually haven't seen it myself. I've been looking for it. I had a friend tell me about it, and he actually, and he's in the news business, so he's a reliable source. He said that there was a video of that particular, the Greenville sheriff that was talking about it, and he said, "Look, sometimes some of your rights have to be suspended." So I mean, that was just a fascinating thing to hear a law enforcement officer say. So yeah, I was actually, that was my next question to you, but.
Well, I'll tell you something that I did hear. This now, the pastor, in his video about this, he is having a few interactions with several of the deputies there, and he says that they told him that we don't care about the Constitution, we don't care about the First Amendment. Well,
That's astounding.
The problem with that is, to be a police officer in Mississippi, you have to take an oath saying that you will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Mississippi. So he's saying he doesn't care. Now, I have to say, in fairness, the pastor said that. I did not hear the officer actually say that. But
Sure.
That's what he says the officer said. But now the pastor went on to say, you better print up some more tickets because we're going to be meeting again Friday night and we're going to be meeting again Sunday morning. And then the Mississippi governor got into the act, and he strongly reprimanded the mayor of Greenville for that policy and said, we have freedom of religion here in Mississippi, and if you're arresting people for going to church, you're going to have a revolt. And now another legal group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, a very good group,
Right.
but the Alliance Defending Freedom now has filed a lawsuit against Greenville on behalf of the pastor and the church. And so that'll probably go some of the same direction as the one in Kentucky.
You know, one thing that I wanted to ask you about, since you brought up the First Amendment, of course, the first thing that our minds go to when we're talking about it in this context, when there are religious groups involved, is the free exercise clause and the portion of the First Amendment that talks about the freedom of religion. But sometimes people forget that there are 5 rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, and one of those rights is also the right to assembly. And is it not also true that they could get into some testy legal waters denying people the ability to assemble together? I mean, I think that you could make a fairly strong case that there were actually 2 First Amendment violations in some of these cases.
Well, at least there's also a free speech violation, too. I mean, you're assembled for the purpose of hearing speech and giving speech. And if you deny that kind of assembly, you're violating free speech, you're violating free exercise of religion, and you're violating freedom of assembly. Now, I think that that's a violation of freedom of assembly because some seem to think that freedom of assembly applies only for the purpose of petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. But when you see right after freedom peaceably to assemble, there's a comma right after that.
Right.
Which I think clearly means that the right to petition is an entirely separate right from the right to assemble. You can petition without assembling, and you can assemble without petition.
Right. I mean, that's one of those things where a comma can actually make a great deal of difference, which is why I will fight to my last breath to include the Oxford comma.
Absolutely.
But
Okay.
anyway, one thing that I wanted to ask about, too, because there have been some churches that have assembled.
You heard the story about that, about the place of the comma there, how commas save lives.
Oh yeah.
The statement, let's eat grandma versus let's eat comma grandma.
Yeah, I've seen that one as well. But, punctuation definitely important, especially in legal matters. But one thing I wanted to ask you about as well, there have been some churches that continue to meet and are meeting inside their building, but have either received fines or their minister has been arrested, even though they are following social distancing protocol. One story that came up a couple weeks ago in the Tampa Bay area with the River Church was their preacher got arrested despite the fact that in this particular worship place of worship, they had sanitizing stations at the entrance and exit, and each person was required to sanitize their hands upon entrance and exit. All of their workers were required to wear gloves. They had the auditorium and they had all the other areas in the church marked off to where they were all 6 feet apart. And they actually spent thousands of dollars on fancy top-of-the-line air purifiers to try to keep any sort of, droplets or whatever that could spread the virus to a minimum. So I was just astounded by this, that even when a church takes precautions well above what you're seeing in your everyday Lowe's or Walmart or other places of business, that the church is getting shut down, but the businesses aren't.
Well, you're correct on that one, too. As far as the Tampa church, I can only say that I've seen only the statement that the pastor has released on behalf of his council, Liberty Council, a very good group also that is representing them. And according to that statement, everything you have said about the steps they have taken is absolutely true. I have not heard the other side, and I can't verify them.
Sure.
I might add, in addition to that, the pastor says that they were told by the sheriff on Saturday before that Sunday that this would be okay. And then the department apparently, without any advance notice, changed their minds and came in and filed the charge. And so, again, I base that only on the pastor's statement, and released through Liberty Council. But if that is true, then I think we have an egregious violation here.
Right, and this really all comes back to one basic question. Why is it that it seems that what we're observing now with religious liberty, that it feels as though that's the thing that you can get rid of the easiest? And I think that this is sort of an attitude more than a legal question, but I did want to get your take on it and sort of the legal reasons why this is the case. It almost feels as though what's going on here is that the government has essentially deemed worship non-essential. And
in many cases, yes. Now, we see these various governor's orders all across the nation here, and they vary. For example, the last I was told, the order of the governor in Pennsylvania specifically includes churches as being essential services, and you can go to church. Likewise in Texas, when they listed the places that would be closed, somebody asked the governor, well, you haven't mentioned churches. Why? And he said, because First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, and so it didn't cover there. The governor of Michigan did not at first exempt churches, and later did not actually exempt churches, but said that people would not be prosecuted for going to church.
Right. Other
states have taken different positions on this. Montana has a rule against any and all social gatherings outside of any size outside the home, but no restrictions on social gatherings in the home. So if you want to have your gathering in your home and you can have 50 people in your home, it appears there's no problem on that in Montana. So this varies so much.
Well, that's because there's only 50 people in the entire state.
Well, that's pretty close.
But
I'll tell you, I've been out there. I love the Big Sky. The Big Sky country is well named. You have room to stretch in Montana. But, James Madison, the man who, more than anybody else, would probably be considered the father of the Constitution,
right?
He made the statement in his memorial and remonstrance, "It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens and one of the noblest characteristics of the late revolution." In other words, he's saying that even if it's a very minor limitation, we still need to take alarm at it because that sets the precedent for a greater limitation at a later time. If I can add one thing more, here's something that a lot of people may not quite understand here, and that's that some people think, well, there's no problem with religious freedom here because churches are allowed to live stream. Well, live streaming a service may satisfy the religious convictions of some.
Right.
But it does not satisfy the religious convictions of others. And many others would point to Hebrews 10:25, that we are to not forsake the assembling together of ourselves as being a command that we do more than just tune in, that we actually be there. And anyway, so if live streaming satisfies your religious convictions, that's fine. But that doesn't mean it satisfies somebody else's religious convictions, and they're entitled to their free exercise of religion just like you are.
Well, Colonel, I got to tell you, personally, my church has moved to live streaming, and I'm fine with that. In fact, when I had cancer a couple years ago, I had to, when I was, the weeks that I had my really heavy doses of chemo and couldn't really get out at all, I would live stream quite frequently, and that was fine with me. But the thing is here, it's not about what I personally am okay with, because what I'm doing is, and this is what I'm asking other Christians to do that probably are live streaming and doing the same thing and are fine with it. You have to look at the ones that, you're right, it may not satisfy everybody's religious conviction. And if you understand that and look down the road at what could come later, This is the argument that I've been having, unfortunately, with people who I consider devout Christians that are just saying, no, we should just ignore it and they should be allowed to shut down churches. And my comeback to that, and what I'm asking them to consider here, is right now the reason that they are saying the state is allowed to shut down a church service is because it's dangerous. But then I remind them that there are people in power, mayors, governors, that would believe that preaching Romans chapter 1 is dangerous because of what it says about homosexuality.
Absolutely.
They would believe the same thing about 1 Corinthians 6. They would believe the same thing about Sodom and Gomorrah. You could get into Matthew 19 and what it says about marriage and divorce. I mean, you could just go on, and they would say, if you let the standard be, well, someone in power considers it dangerous, therefore we should allow them to shut it down. I mean, you could shut down virtually every place of worship in the United States.
Fortunately, we have a First Amendment that says you can't do that. And in Alabama here, we have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act that gives that extra special protection here.
Mm-hmm.
But let me just add one thing else on that. Back in 1849, there was a cholera epidemic that swept across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And in response to this, President Zachary Taylor issued a national fasting proclamation, and he requested that on the fasting day that people abstain from their secular occupations and that they assemble in their respective places of worship to pray to God for deliverance. Now, I think one of the things that's maybe difficult for some to understand as they think about the role of religion in our society here is that praying to God is not just a little ritual we go through to satisfy our egos and so on.
Right.
We pray to God because we believe he is real.
Mm-hmm.
And because we believe he answers prayer. And this was the belief on which our nation was founded. And
with the firm
believing that God is real.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Prayer,
go ahead.
Yeah, believing that he's real and believing that he answers prayer means that the authorities would want the churches open praying for deliverance from the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm. No, what you said is exactly right. I mean, the finishing line in the Declaration of Independence is with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So absolutely,
exactly.
That was something that this country was founded upon. They believe that is an integral part of American life. So it's not just a constitutional rights issue, which I believe it absolutely is. You also have to go back to the intent and what's behind that as well. Well, thank you so much.
Let me add one.
Oh, go ahead.
Ask you one thing else.
Go ahead.
Before we close here, and that's that.
Yes, sir.
I am not trying to stir up trouble. I mean, Romans 13 says that we are to obey the governmental authorities, and I have been a military officer, served in the Air Force for 23 years. I believe in law and order. I believe in obeying the law. But remember, Paul says there that we are to be subject to the government authorities because they command what is right and they forbid what is wrong. He doesn't consider the circumstance. What happens when government forbids what is right and commands what is wrong? And there we go back to Acts 5:29, where the disciples are forbidden to preach in Christ, and they respond, we must obey God rather than man.
Acts 4:29. I believe so. I believe it's Acts 4.
Well, there's a passage similar to that in Acts 4, but I'm talking about Acts 5:29.
Oh, okay. I apologize. I was just
check me out.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong, I owe you a steak dinner. Okay? but there is a similar
from 6 feet apart, of course.
Exactly. 20 verses apart. But the point of the matter is, we obey God.
Right.
But we obey God in a way that also obeys the civil authorities if we can do so.
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately, I think that's what it comes down to. Our duties as American citizens and our duty as Christians is to take these things seriously, especially when somebody's right to religious liberty is being persecuted, because for all we know, it could be us next, and that's the reason we have to stay vigilant on these things. Well, it has been incredibly enlightening going through this interview. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to converse with me. It's truly been something that has been enlightening. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our audience real quick before we take off here?
Acts 5:29. Then Peter and the other disciples answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men.
Thank you so much. That is Colonel John Eidsmoe. I did say it right that time, didn't I?
That's right.
Okay, got it. Colonel John Eidsmoe, the Foundation for Moral Law. Thank you so much for your time, and you have a wonderful day. God bless you.
You too, and let's do this again.
Looking forward to it. Have a good one. All right, well, we're going to be back in just a minute. We'll take a quick break here, and we will be back on Tactics.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
All right, here we are. So you guys remember last year, one of the things I talked about in a segment called Straw Wars is how the liberals, despite no scientific evidence or backing whatsoever, believe that somehow they are saving the sea life by banning plastic straws. In response to this, Mellow Mushroom has started giving out paper straws as opposed to plastic straws. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how effective the paper straws are with the most difficult drink to drink, a milkshake. Let's see how this stands up. All right, so first of all, I got about 2 sips out of that, and the paper stuck to my lips. This thing does not work too well. Boy, it'd take you 2 hours to drink this with this.
Well, see, I'm using plastic.
That's John from Millbrook, by the way. He's
I
the one
don't care.
driving.
I think they use plastic because that's the best thing to use.
This thing sucks. Well, actually, it doesn't suck. If it sucked, I'd be fine with it, but it doesn't. This milkshake will melt before I finish this. All right. Experiment over. It's biodegradable. All right. We're going to fix this now. There we go. Good old petroleum-based plastic straws. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Oh, that's so much better.
I got a question about this.
Oh yeah?
With the paper, aren't they concerned about the trees, having to cut down the trees to make the straws too? Is that not a...
Well, that's one of the points that I made. It doesn't matter what you make the straw out of. You're expending some kind of resource.
Well, yeah, because we all live here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't matter what you make any product out of. You're expending some kind of resource. Mm-hmm. And that's true of straws or anything else. Well, I tell you this. Just based on this little experiment, I know that I saw that Disney is planning to go completely paper straw by 2020 on all their cruise lines and all of their amusement parks. I contend that Disney World is not the happiest place on earth if I can't drink a Dead Blame milkshake while I'm there.
But I will, to their defense, say one thing.
Oh?
You can take a pocket knife in. So help me.
That's something.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, so even though this went about the way I expected it to, paper straw experiment failed miserably. I imagine if I had left it in there much longer, it would have dissolved. I had a buddy the other day that went to a place that used paper straws. He said he had to order 6 different straws throughout the course of his meal because they kept dissolving on him. Which I'm sitting there thinking, you can't tell me that using 1 plastic straw is worse for the environment than 6 paper straws. I mean, that's just common sense. Anyway, all right, thanks guys. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my milkshake.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, the other day, of course, we had a show, and there were a couple things that we missed in that we didn't get a chance to cover during Tramp. Man, it's like being in a Disney movie. in Trump's press conference that we weren't able to cover just because we actually had to cut it off and go on the air to be able to do that. So I wanted to cover a couple things that he went over with the media that we didn't have a chance to cover yesterday. So there's actually two things in this daily dose of stupid, and there's two sources of it, both the media and President Trump himself. So there was plenty of stupid to go around. And like I said yesterday, I don't know if it was politically feasible to just go after the media the way that he did. In a lot of ways, it was definitely not undeserved, I'll say that. And you'll actually see evidence of that in this segment as well. But yesterday, the media just absolutely peppered Trump with questions about him retweeting something that at the tail end of it had the hashtag Fire Fauci. So Dr. Fauci, who of course is on his team, he's one of the head experts when it comes to epidemics and helping Trump sort of navigate the waters on what's safe to do, what's not, advising him on some of that stuff. And there are a lot of people that are upset with him. They kind of run with this narrative that Trump has been duped and that Fauci is either knowingly or unknowingly either just grossly incompetent or lying to him, and because of that, Fauci needs to be fired. There was a point that one particular person made, and Trump retweeted it, and because that retweet, remember, Trump didn't say it, it was somebody that he retweeted their tweet and didn't give any commentary on it. They assumed that because he had the hashtag in there, Fire Fauci, that it must be that Trump really wanted to fire Fauci or that Trump was going to fire Fauci. Now, there's a couple things that I want to bring up. First of all, it's important to understand some of the context that this is taking place in, because this is not operating inside a vacuum. The media has been trying to, for about 2 to 3 weeks now, really sort of push this narrative that Fauci is the hero that is trying to save the country from Trump just completely destroying it and not caring about it. They've been trying to craft this soap opera that's going on behind the scenes that, frankly, I've seen very little evidence of. I know that Fauci and Trump have probably disagreed on how to handle a few things, and I'm certain that they, especially as much as both of them are on TV right now, have said a few things that don't agree with one another, but that would happen even if it were the most ardent Trump supporter and Trump himself. That's going to happen if you're on camera that much in such a short amount of time. So the media has been trying to create this fable that is going on, and I don't know, maybe it's going on, but I haven't seen any evidence for it. The media is making this up, so far as I can tell, completely out of whole cloth, that Dr. Fauci and Trump they hate each other, they are in wild disagreement, and Trump doesn't want to listen to Fauci, and Fauci is basically trying to struggle the reins of power away from him, which is also stupid because Fauci has no power. Fauci influences power, but he has no power himself. If Trump wanted to ignore Fauci, he could. That is his prerogative. He's the president of the United States. So there's a myriad of reasons why this whole narrative that the media has been going with for a while now is stupid. That being one of the chief arguments against it. But here's the thing that we need to be aware of, because two things can be true at once. You can believe both of these things simultaneously and not be in contradiction of yourself. One, a retweet does not constitute agreement. It doesn't. I retweet people all the time that I disagree with. I've retweeted AOC. I've retweeted all kinds of people. Sometimes those tweets contain things that I disagree with. Now, normally I include with that a disclaimer saying that I don't agree with it. Sometimes I just let the tweet speak for itself. And the average person within the Twitter sphere understands this, that just because you retweet somebody does not mean you're agreeing with them. I retweet Democrats all the time. I retweet people in the mainstream media that say things that I disagree with. Sometimes just say, hey, look at this, and I'm putting it on spectacle. Sometimes I retweet people and just want to see what the reactions are. I'm not even necessarily agreeing or disagreeing. I just want to see what the reaction is. I think it is smart when you retweet that if you do have something in that retweet that you disagree with, to add some kind of disclaimer. I think that's a good practice under most circumstances. But we also ought not to assume that because somebody retweeted somebody, that that's actually what they're thinking and what's going on in their head. It's also possible to agree with part of a retweet and not another one. here's another thing that can also be true. Retweeting something that you disagree with without giving that that disclaimer or that comment, it's dumb. It is. And so those are the two things that can be true at the same time. Retweeting something that contains something that you disagree with without adding that disclaimer, bad idea. But it also does not necessarily mean the person retweeting the thing agrees with it. This is not a difficult standard for people to understand, but the media had a really, really hard time understanding it yesterday because they desperately want this narrative that they've been pushing for a couple weeks now, that Dr. Fauci and Donald Trump secretly hate each other and are not on the same page, and Trump is constantly trying to undermine him, which again is ridiculous because Trump is the one with all the control and with all the power. And so they're wanting to cast it this way because they believe Orange Man bad and Trump can never be right. And so if there's a lot of good things happening, they can chalk that all up to Dr. Fauci. I'll use a quick analogy here to help you understand this, that everybody in the state will readily understand. Auburn fans, and I say this as a proud alumni of Auburn, alumnus, that's the right one. I went to journalism school. I should know these things. It's alumnus. As a proud alumnus of Auburn University, I can say this. There are certain sects of the Auburn faithful that whenever something goes wrong on the football field, automatically what happened is the offensive coordinator took over. And it's not even necessarily the current one. This has been going on for the past 3 offensive coordinators. And when something goes right on the field, it must be because Gus turned over control of it to him. And then when something goes horribly wrong, it's because Gus took over and is calling the plays. Which may or may not be true, but the point is, it's an unfalsifiable claim. And what typically I think is going on is that Auburn fans that don't like Gus Malzahn are just scapegoating him. And if anything goes wrong, it's always Gus Malzahn's fault. And if anything goes right, it's because Gus Malzahn took a step back and offensive coordinator took over. This is a mind-numbingly aggravating thing to deal with when you're watching an Auburn football game. But the same thing is going on and playing out in real time here. If the federal government ever does something right, it's just because what Donald Trump did is he stood back and let Dr. Fauci basically call the play on this one. And if anything goes wrong, it's because Trump had some influence into it. This is basically the narrative that the media is trying to cast here. And so they really loved the fact that he retweeted somebody with the hashtag Fire Fauci. He didn't say it, but he was essentially quoting somebody else saying it, and they just went giddy with anticipation. But here's the thing about it that the media is forgetting, because I'm older than a month old. And I can remember when the media did not hold people to this standard, because I did this exact story. I didn't pull this from the internet. I pulled it from my old show notes back on March 17th, because I think the tweet was actually issued on the 16th. You can go back and look at a tweet by Rashida Tlaib, for example. This is just less than a month ago. This was a tweet by David Hogg that Rashida Tlaib retweeted. Don't let this administration address COVID-19 like our national gun violence epidemic. F a national day of prayer. We need immediate comprehensive action. So what happened with this tweet is that it was immediately retweeted by Representative Rashida Tlaib. You remember, of course, when the media found her at a press conference and peppered her with questions asking if she really thought that if the National Day of Prayer was the right thing, or that she hated the National Day of Prayer, or if she was anti-Christian or any of that stuff. Oh, wait, you don't remember that because it never happened. You see, when Rashida Tlaib retweets something controversial, the media just forgets to ask her about it. I looked through as much, even today, went through as much of the news as I could. I went through 3 or 4 pages of Google on their news section, and I also went through different news organizations and searched their individual websites. I found plenty of hits on The Blaze and Conservative Review and The Daily Wire and Washington Examiner. You know how many hits I found on The Washington Post, The New York Times? I didn't see one. Maybe it was there and I missed it, but I didn't see any coverage from the left. on this. And then because a bunch of people on Twitter, not news organizations, but because people on Twitter called her out on retweeting David Hogg saying F the National Day of Prayer, Rashida Tlaib came out with this explanation. So if you look, she says, "Let me be clear as someone who has been praying through all of this and as someone who has attended the National Prayer Breakfast. My retweet was not an attack on prayer. It was to bring public attention to the need for a meaningful action to combat this public health crisis." Oh, okay. I think I'm understanding what you're saying now. You're saying that just because you retweeted something does not necessarily mean you agree with it. Now, the difference in this and what Donald Trump retweeted is because, A, this was not in a hashtag that is essentially just a tag. Again, you don't even necessarily, the person tweeting doesn't necessarily agree with the hashtag. I don't know how many of my articles about abortion or videos about abortion that I've posted with the hashtag pro-choice, hoping that other people are going to find it that are pro-choice and watch it and maybe let it change their mind. Just because I'm tweeting out pro-choice or things like hashtag abortion is a woman's right or abortion rights or something, that doesn't mean I agree with it. It means I want people searching for those keywords to find my tweet. This wasn't a hashtag at the end of it. It was David Hogg saying F the National Day of Prayer, and Rashida Tlaib retweeting it again without comment. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what Rashida Tlaib means by that, but I can't come up with another reason for that. I mean, that's all he said. It was a very short tweet, and really all he said was F the National Day of Prayer. I can't think of a reason why Rashida Tlaib would have retweeted that if that's not really how she felt. But nonetheless, that same standard was not applied to Trump by the media. They ignored it when Rashida Tlaib did it. When Trump did it, we've got to ask him all these questions and make sure if that's really what he believes or not. The mainstream media just completely ignored it with Rashida Tlaib, and that double standard is on display. Now, yesterday, this is the second half of this. Yesterday, right after the show started, so I didn't get a chance to comment on this one because I was on the air. I didn't actually get to see it. There was a back and forth between President Trump and a journalist when Trump essentially said that he has absolute authority when it comes to matters on reopening the states economically. So you can watch this exchange, a couple of exchanges actually, via CNN.
Somebody's the president of the United States. The authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be.
Total. Your authority is total.
It's total. It's total.
Your authority
And the governors
total.
know that.
So if a
the governors know that. Now you have a couple of bands of excuse me. You have a couple.
Could you rescind that order?
You have a couple of bands of Democrat governors, but they will agree to it. They will agree to it. But the authority of the President of the United States having to do with the subject we're talking about is total.
You said when someone is President of the United States, their authority is total. That is not true. Who
Okay,
told
you know
that?
what we're going to do? We're going to write up papers on this. It's not going to be necessary because the governors need us one way or the other, because ultimately it comes with the federal government. That being said, we're getting along very well with the governors, and I feel very certain that there won't be a problem. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Has any governor agreed that you have the authority to decide when their state
I haven't
opens
asked
back up?
anybody because
But
I
no
don't.
one has
You know why?
agreed.
Because I don't have to.
All right, so you can very readily see there President Trump going back and forth with journalists. And this is one of the rare cases where I think the journalists are actually correct. It's stupid for President Trump to say this. This is sort of Trump's side of the daily dose of stupid. It is untrue, first of all. We have a federal government which has states which are actually sovereign. The states created the Fed, not the other way around. Trump does not have total authority. In fact, he doesn't even have the prevailing authority in this. And what's really strange about all this is that President Trump saying this cuts against both his approach and what he's done so far and what he said. Now, I wouldn't find it that weird if him saying this just cut against what he said and not what he's done, but not what he said. In other words, his approach doesn't match his words. But this also cuts against what Trump has already said about the matter, saying that he's going to let the governors lead. It was very, very odd. It's a very strange heel turn here. So President Trump saying this, first of all, it smacked of dictatorship. I don't think that that's what President Trump was going for. It was a dumb thing to do. The optics on it are really, really bad, especially at a time where there's a lot of eyes on him. And just as somebody who cares about federalism, cares about individual liberties, cares about rights, and cares about the states, I can't see any way how this could be interpreted in a positive light. I just can't see it. I've heard the interpretation from some commentators that this is just a negotiation tactic. Maybe it is, I don't know, but even if it is, you still shouldn't say it. Like, there are certain things that even if it were an effective negotiating tactic and you were guaranteed to, by saying this, get the result that you wanted, you still don't freaking say it. Now, there's a pretty wide gap between what Trump says and what he does sometimes. So I'm willing to admit that it may be, and based on his approach thus far, this wouldn't be too far out of the question, that what President Trump actually winds up doing is saying one thing and doing something completely different. That's a very... It would be an unsurprising conclusion to this if that's what wound up actually happening, that President Trump says that he's going to come down on people and that he has total authority and then acts like he doesn't. That would be pretty standard operating procedure for President Trump. But the odd thing here, and the thing that I'm having a hard time really comprehending and getting over, is that it's so different than what he has said in the past. His whole approach has been a very state-driven, let them decide when to close it down and let them decide what's best for their state, which is the approach I prefer. And he's not only done that, he's been saying that for weeks on end, and the reason that he did this is baffling. And the negotiation argument, though I don't like it, and I don't think it's a good justification for why he said this, that does make sense with the fact that he had such a quick heel turn. Here's another one that also makes sense, and I hope that this is not the correct interpretation because I don't like this one, obviously, is that President Trump has done what a lot of presidents do, which is, I'll play by the rules up until the point the rules no longer work for me. It is possible that he did the exact same thing that President Obama did with Obamacare and with DACA. That he decided all of a sudden, you know what, I'm going to follow the Constitution. Oh, wait, the Constitution's getting in the way? Yeah, well, screw that then. Or you could imagine with DACA, he essentially did the same thing. He says, look, I want Congress to act, but if they don't act, I have a pen and I have a phone, and I'm going to take care of it myself. In other words, I'd like to play by the rules, but if they don't give me what I want, I'm just going to do it I'm going to do whatever I want anyway. Maybe that's what happened with Trump. I don't know. I hope that that is not the case. But this is a really bad time to be playing with fire with the separation of powers and with trying to undermine federalism. Look, the reason that our states are not a homogeneous country and they are individual sovereign states is because in times like this, especially when we're dealing with something that is to some degree, I wouldn't say completely unprecedented, I think that's overblowing it, but to some degree unprecedented, certainly something that has not happened in the vast majority of the people who are living now's lifetimes, I'm really glad that states can take an individual approach. The people that are closest to the people can make decisions because what's right for the people in Alabama might be completely different for the people in Wyoming. I was making the joke in the interview with the last one that the state of Montana only has 50 people. Now, of course, I'm being goofy and exaggerating, but they're already social distancing because they're 50 miles away from their nearest neighbor. So their policies are going to look super different than New Jersey, and they should. And the fact that governors who understand that, who understand the cultural differences, understand the differences in the economy, are making those decisions on an individual basis on when to open their state back up, when to close the state back down, and people that will be most accountable to the voters in that particular state, that's the reason we have federalism in the first place. So that a lower level, a more localized government can be making the majority of the decisions. Whether or not I agree with Trump on certain issues, I would still rather the states have more control. California might do something I think is really dumb. California does that all the time. Still not my place to step in and say, as somebody who doesn't live there, that I need to dictate down to them what their state laws ought to be. I think most of their laws are stupid. But it's up to them. And if they screw up, they screw up. So this was a really bad look. I don't like the fact that President Trump came out and did this. But here's the other side of that coin. Because you may have also noticed in that clip that out of the, I believe, 4 banners that went across the screen, that there were a couple of them that were just absolutely ridiculous, saying that President Trump put together a propaganda video at taxpayer expense. And you can just tell CNN has a seething disdain for this guy and is using every opportunity to tell lies about him and trot that out as though he's done something wrong there. Look, here's just, I think it's funny because I've been here the entire time talking about federalism. All through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, I've cared about this stuff since the beginning. You know who hasn't? The left in the media. And yet, all of a sudden, miraculously, they discovered federalism overnight. It's amazing, isn't it? It's kind of like how Alyssa Milano suddenly discovered due process. I mean, sure, it's been around for 230 years, but thank God Alyssa Milano discovered it so the rest of us can sit at her feet and bask in the glory of her brilliance, coming up with an idea that we've had since the beginning of this nation. And the left in the media did exactly the same thing with federalism yesterday. Let's go ahead and look at this tweet, for example, from Governor Cuomo. So if you look at this one, here's Governor Cuomo quoting Alexander Hamilton. Quote, "State governments possess inherent advantages, which will ever give them an influence and ascendancy over the national government, and will forever preclude the possibility of federal encroachments. That their liberties can be subverted by the federal head is repugnant." Alexander Hamilton. Yeah, I got no problem with that. Governor Cuomo, you're exactly right. Finally, Governor Cuomo actually tweets something out that I can applaud him for, something that actually makes sense. And by the way, in response to this, I'm glad that the left also discovered the founders and that maybe those guys had some good ideas and we should listen to them every now and then. Federalism and the founders all in one night. Here's another tweet from the New York Times. So the New York Times did a fact check on this the other day. Fact check. President Trump falsely and repeatedly asserted that he had unilateral power to compel states to lift stay-at-home orders and businesses to open. Now, here's the thing. Just like with Governor Cuomo's tweet, I agree with the New York Times on this. But I'm just sitting here like, wow, they finally discovered federalism. Where was this Governor Cuomo? Where was this New York Times? Where was this the other hundreds of people on the left and in the media that were tweeting about federalism today? Where were they through 8 freaking years of Obama? Where were they when Obama was trying to compel the states, for example, and enforcing this, that gay marriage is now universal? Every state has to do it. Where was he when he was trying to keep the states from enforcing their own borders? I don't recall the media quoting Alexander Hamilton and siphoning through the Constitution to see who has authority here when that happened. And so, yes, what Trump said was stupid. I denounce it in the strongest possible terms. I couldn't disagree with it more, but at the same time, I'm not going to take a lecture on federalism from the media who ignored it when their guy was in office. This is why you guys have no leg to stand on. Because all of a sudden it's real important that we follow the Constitution the second somebody is in power that you don't like. But when it's somebody that is your guy, it really doesn't matter. He can do what he wants. That's why the American people don't trust you. There's an obvious double standard here. I got to tell you, during the Obama administration, I heard the words incorporation doctrine and supremacy clause so much I wanted to throw up. That everybody, every time I brought up something, hey, what President Barack Obama is doing is a pretty clear violation of the 10th Amendment, they're like, the supremacy clause, he can do what he wants, you know, the Constitution, it's supreme. No, you idiot, we have a 10th Amendment. And now that Trump's in office, they've suddenly discovered this. What an idea. Gosh, if only there were somebody calling for that for the past 8 years. They're just such a bunch of slimy hypocrites that act like they care about this stuff when we remember that when it was somebody that they liked in office, they just ignored it. They had no interest in digging into the Constitution or seeking the advice of the founders. It's so transparent, and this is the reason that there are people that aren't real married to the founders or conservatism. They just really want to get one up on the left. They completely ignore that. They look at that and go, you guys have no credibility, and you know what? They're right. Now, I agree with the New York Times and Andrew Cuomo and all the other people on the left that were outraged at this. But at the same time, I understand that that's not a lecture that I'm going to take from you. You lost all your credibility with the way you handled Obama. I'm done with you. And millions of other Americans are too. I'm fine. I'm perfectly okay. And I'm perfectly okay with dishing it out as well as receiving it and taking it in when it comes to criticism of this president. But the left has no leg to stand on, and neither does the media. I'm just not going to freaking take it from them because they're such hypocrites. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today does come from the book of Samuel. We've been studying through the book of Samuel, and you may recall that in the last session that we had here, what was going on is that Samuel had received the call from the Lord. He thought it was Eli calling him. He comes to Eli's side 3 times. Finally, Eli figures out, wait a second, he's not hearing me, he's hearing the Lord. And he says, all right, Samuel, go and lay down. And when you hear that voice again, say, Lord, your servant heareth, and then take whatever message that God is going to give you. And this is exactly what happens. And so the message that the Lord gives to Samuel that night is a prophecy that Eli's sons are going to die and then he's going to die in the same day. It's a very evil prophecy in the sense that it's something that obviously the people involved are not going to like, and this is a punishment for something that we actually talked about in a previous episode, a previous Chaplain's Report, where we were talking about how Eli, despite being faithful to God himself, ultimately put his sons on a pedestal that was higher than God, and that's something that God simply could not tolerate. As his punishment, this is the fate that awaits both him and his sons. So that's really where we start off here. And in the morning, Eli calls him, and that's where this verse comes in 1 Samuel 3, verses 16 through 18. Then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. And he said, What is the word that he spoke to you? Please do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you. So Samuel told him everything, and hid nothing from him, and said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. There's a couple different ways to look at this story, and I think that each one is just as enlightening as the other. First of all, this took a great deal of faith for Samuel, because that had to be a hard message to deliver. As a prophet, and we know this from the biblical record, there are times when a prophet gets to bring really good news. I mean, you see times where a prophecy comes of a child being born, or some kind of deliverance from God, some kind of victory in battle. There's all kinds of different prophecies that can be of really good report. But it's interesting to me that the very first time God speaks to Samuel, a young child, the news that he's given to give to Eli, it's bad news. It's not just bad news, it's kind of the worst news you can get, that you and your family are going to be wiped off the planet. Like that, especially in Jewish culture, that's about as bad as it gets. That not only will you cease to exist, but your family lineage, which was very important to the Jewish people, that's not going to exist anymore. Your sons and your heirs are going to be knocked off of that as well. There's no doubt this was hard for Eli to hear. And it was very hard for Samuel to say to the man who raised him like a father that this was the fate that was awaiting him. I'm sure it was not only hard for Samuel to tell Eli, but also pretty hard for him to hear. To put it in context, what if you heard God tell you in a prophecy that your dad was going to suffer a fate like that? And I know Eli's not his dad, but he's the closest thing that he's had to a father, so far as we can tell. You can even see in that passage where Eli calls him my son. And so Samuel gets really bad news as a very young boy. And he's given the task with being honest with Eli and telling him, and that had to be something that was scary for him. He didn't know how Eli was going to react, and you gotta commend Samuel's faith at such a young age to be able to deliver a very difficult message that he didn't want to hear, and he didn't want Eli to have to hear either. But ultimately, and granted, a little prodding from Eli probably helped, but ultimately he had faith that God was going to work everything out. Ultimately, he had faith that, yeah, I don't want to bring this thing, and I could lie about it, but I'm not. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the whole truth. And what God has given me to tell others, I'm not going to abridge it. The truth is going to hurt, but I'm going to bring it anyway. I mean, that's a faith that we're supposed to emulate, isn't it? Sometimes the world's not going to like what we say. In fact, most of the time, the world is not going to like what we say. There's going to be an awful lot of times where what we say actually puts us at odds with the vast majority of the human race. Say it anyway. You don't compromise the truth. You don't water down God's word. You don't give it a flowery presentation. You don't mince words. I'm not saying you can't change your approach every once in a while, but if you ever do that and water down the message or change the message, you've done something that you're not supposed to do. You have usurped God's authority in saying, this is what is true, this is what I want you to tell other people. If you try to put a smiley face on it or sugarcoat it, that's not something that Jesus did, that's not something that God did. And we see right here, even as a little boy, that's not something that Samuel was willing to do either. He told everything exactly the way that God gave it in all of its terrible and horrific detail. But it was still the right thing to do, because that's what God told him to say. And we're supposed to do exactly the same thing with the scripture. But on the other side of this, I know that this is a bad end for Eli. I know that Eli made a really big mistake in putting something ahead of God. But you got to admire Eli's faith, at least in this one matter as well. Because look at how this ends. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Basically, what Eli is saying here is, if the Lord has determined that this is good, I'm deferring to his judgment. I'm taking it on his authority that this is the right thing to happen. I don't like it. I don't want it to happen. But if that's God's decision, I can live with it. Or in this case, not live with it. Well, he has to live with it for a little while. Ultimately, he had to have faith that if this is God's judgment, God is always right. May not like the judgment, doesn't matter. If God decided it, I abide by it, even if it means my death. Isn't that exactly what Christians are called to do as well? That in times where what he commands us doesn't seem good or convenient or something we like, whether it's something that says, no, I'm sorry, you can't marry that person. No, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to go out and do whatever you want to. You're held accountable to me. You can't use language like that. You can't use this substance. And you can't lie to people. You can't, waffle back and forth on these things. No, I'm sorry. You got to tell people what sin is and what sin isn't. That's part of the calling that I've given you as a Christian. That we have to decide that it's the Lord. Let him do what seems good. It's the Lord. If he says it, he's got a good reason. And so even though this is a pretty horrible end for Eli. And as Bible characters go, Eli has a pretty rough end of his story compared to most of them. But even so, I do appreciate that Eli has the proper perspective when the end does come. Ultimately, it is the Lord should be all the justification that a Christian needs when suffering comes his way. That it comes down to whenever there's something in our life we can't explain, there's something that's coming our way that we don't like, we say, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good. I accept it. Because God wouldn't do this. God wouldn't put me in a situation. God wouldn't allow me to enter into this temptation if I wasn't ready for it. And I got to tell you, that's sometimes a really, really hard attitude to adopt. But ultimately, it hits at the core of God's nature. God is good. God is loving. God cares about us. If all those things are true, then at the end of the day, we should be able to say it is the Lord. So if he has determined it, then it is good. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright